Hi there. In this video I'm going to give you some advice on how you can go about reducing exam or other assessment related stress when you're studying. So let's start by defining what we mean by stress. It might surprise you to learn that there isn't actually a universally agreed on definition of stress. But one conceptualization of stress that's proved particularly popular over the last 3 decades or so is the transactional model of stress, originally proposed by Lazarus and Folkman back in 1984. According to the transactional model of stress, stress occurs when an individual is exposed to a stimuli or an event which they perceive as threatening, challenging, or harmful in some way, and which exceeds their perceived coping capacity. You'll probably have noticed that the transactional model's definition of stress puts a good deal of emphasis on the way in which we evaluate or appraise stimuli or events that occur within our environment. If an event, such as an exam, is perceived as being threatening or challenging in some way, then we respond to that with negative emotions such as anxiety. Now, the way we deal with that is often to initiate some kind of coping strategy. And this coping strategy may be directed at the event itself. For example, we might start revising for the exam, or it might be directed at the emotion associated with that event. For example, we might try and deal with our anxiety by talking to a friend. All this talk about appraising a stressor such as an exam and our capacity to cope with it sounds very rational and reasoned and measured. In fact, having learned about the transactional model of stress, you might even think to yourself, well, why on earth does anyone ever get stressed about something like an exam in the first place? But the thing is, often when we're confronted by something that could be perceived as challenging or threatening, we unwittingly default to rather negative and irrational patterns of thinking. The legendary psychologist and psychotherapist Dr. Aaron Beck called these patterns of thinking cognitive distortions back in 1963. The thing about cognitive distortions is that they can create and exacerbate negative feelings about a particular stimuli or event, effectively turning a drama into a crisis. Fortunately, just as irrational and distorted thinking can make an event like an examination much more stressful than it needs to be, rational, evidence-based thinking can make the same event seem like much less of an ordeal. One thing you can do to promote more rational and more benign thinking about an event like an examination is to practice what psychologists refer to as restructuring or reframing thoughts. This is a process whereby you identify, evaluate, and change distorted patterns of thinking. So let's have a go at identifying a few examples of cognitive distortions that might crop up when exams are on the horizon. We can then evaluate these distortions and think about how they might be replaced with more benign and rational thinking. One common cognitive distortion is referred to as inexact labelling. And this is where our emotional reaction to a stimuli or event, such as an examination, is more of a reflection on the way we describe or label that event than the actual intensity of the event itself. For example, you might have an exam on the horizon and start finding yourself thinking things like, oh, this exam is impossible, it's going to be a complete nightmare. But of course this is irrational because no exam is impossible, otherwise entire cohorts of students would fail and that would be a disaster for any course. Also, there's no point in engaging in this kind of thinking because you couldn't possibly know exactly how a future event is going to turn out. What you can say with some degree of assurance is, having labelled the exam in such an extreme negative way, it's hardly surprising that you're going to start to feel much more anxious about it. If you find yourself referring to a forthcoming exam using really negative and emotion-laden language, immediately challenge yourself to produce a more benign and more rational description of that exam. A description that perhaps encompasses positive coping strategies that you might employ. and positive outcomes that might result from having taken the exam. So rather than think something like, oh, this exam is going to be impossible, a complete nightmare, try something like, this exam is going to be very challenging, but with a considered and thorough approach to revision, I'll get through it just fine. The language you use in describing an event is not trivial. It plays a big part in determining how you feel about that event. So don't big up something like an examination into something it's not by using extremely negative language when you're thinking about it and describing it. A second type of cognitive distortion that can be common when exams are on the horizon is something called arbitrary inference or arbitrary interpretation. And this is when you formulate a view or a conclusion about something like a forthcoming exam that isn't grounded in the available factual evidence, or maybe even runs completely contrary to the available factual evidence. For example, when an exam is on the horizon, you might catch yourself almost automatically thinking things like, oh no, I'm going to fail this exam. But in the absence of any hard evidence to suggest this will most likely be the case, this is a really irrational and unhelpful thought to entertain. It's certainly not going to do anything to reduce the risk that you will fail the exam. In fact, it's likely to have the opposite effect. Because if you've already convinced yourself you're going to fail without any real evidence to suggest that's the case, then this is probably going to dissuade you from doing things like, well, putting much effort into revising for the exam. And this kind of response will increase the likelihood that you'll fail the exam. It's an example of what psychologists refer to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you find yourself making negative inferences about your performance on a forthcoming examination, immediately challenge yourself to dispute this line of thinking using evidence to the contrary. For example, you must have done reasonably well on previous exams because, well, you got into university. You can also look for evidence of things you can use to support you in preparing for the exam. For example, your tutors might be offering consultation. Your course might have a revision session or two. You of course have your course materials that can support you in preparing for the exam. And you may have also found some extracurricular materials that you can use to support you in revising for your examination. A third type of cognitive distortion that can be very common when exams are on the horizon is referred to as overgeneralisation. And this is where someone draws a conclusion about their ability, their performance, or even their worth based on a single previous personal experience. For example, let's say that in preparing for a forthcoming exam, you start to reflect on your performance on previous exams, and you find yourself fixating on that one exam where you underperformed or perhaps even failed, even though that was clearly an isolated incident, a blip on an otherwise really good exam record. Nonetheless, because of that blip, you're convinced that history is going to repeat itself and you're going to fail the forthcoming exam. This would be irrational and distorted thinking, because in fixating or cherry-picking the evidence that relates to that one blip or the exam in which you underperformed, you would be ignoring the weight of the evidence that would suggest that the opposite outcome is likely, i.e. you'll take the exam and you'll do just fine. If you find yourself fixated on an example of an exam from your past that really didn't go very well, then you should immediately question the applicability of that experience to your current situation. It may well be, for example, that the exam that you took previously that didn't go so well was many years ago, and your knowledge about how to revise and your exam technique back then wasn't nearly as good as it is now. Perhaps there were mitigating circumstances that might have accounted for your below average performance. For example, perhaps you were a little bit ill on the day of the exam. One thing you should also do is to actively try and retrieve examples of positive exam experiences from your memory and see whether they might be more applicable to your current situation. Another thing you can do is try and assume the perspective of a third person in reviewing your past exam performance and ask yourself whether that third person would be as pessimistic about your chances of success in the forthcoming exam as you have been, given the evidence that's available for them to review. If you're really having trouble moving past a bad experience of a previous exam, then at least try and avoid focusing on how that experience made you feel. Instead, focus on what precisely went wrong. Because if you can identify what went wrong, then that's a good basis for you also figuring out what you can do to put what went wrong right, and thus avoid finding yourself in a similar situation in the future. Thus you can reframe a bad experience as a learning opportunity. So for example, maybe in a previous exam you ran out of time because you didn't monitor the passage of time correctly and therefore didn't get to answer all of the questions that the exam consisted of. Well, what could you do to address that in future exams and to prevent a reoccurrence of that problem? As the old proverb says, if you fall, it's better to focus on where you tripped than where you ended up. When you have exams on the horizon, it's natural to experience a degree of stress. And you shouldn't pathologise this or feel like a victim in the face of the exams. Remember, you can't always control the events that occur in your life, but you can control how you think about them. And how you think about an examination has a profound effect on how you feel about that examination, which will determine whether you respond to that examination, i.e. prepare for it, positively or negatively, which of course will affect the eventual outcome of that examination. Of course, if at any point during your degree studies you have concerns about your mental health, it's incredibly important you don't keep these to yourself. You need to seek help from an appropriate source. And you shouldn't view a YouTube video as an acceptable alternative to seeking advice from a mental health professional. There are a few things you can do in this regard. Firstly, check out the provisions that are available to you via your university. Most, if not all universities, have teams of counsellors that are available for student consultation. You should check out your university's website to determine how you go about getting in touch with them. Of course, you can also make an appointment with your general practitioner, who, if appropriate, can refer you on to a mental health professional. Or you can reach out directly to a mental health professional. But if you do this, do make sure that they are fully qualified and appropriately accredited. To this end, I'm offering some advice in the description section of this video. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please do hit the like button. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to my channel for more videos on how psychology can help you study more effectively. Turn on the bell notification if you want to know when I post new content. Thanks very much.